Radio Free Campus, brought to you by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni.
Welcome to Radio Free Campus. I'm Steve McGuire.
And I'm Justin Garrison, and this month we're talking about viewpoint diversity in higher ed with our guest Eric Kaufmann, who we'll talk to in just a moment. Steve and I will also discuss the ongoing battle between President Trump and Harvard University, as well as the prospect of DEI for conservatives. That can't be right. We'll have to check about that in post. Anyway, last but not least, we'll do the segment that everyone has been compelled to adore, the Apparatchik of the Month and our Hero of the People Awards. So let's get right down to it. Steve, you were recently in the UK, right?
That's right. As we'll discuss with Eric, he has a new center over there and was holding a conference. So I'd never been to London before, and I was going to the conference. So decided to spend a couple extra days while I was over there, and it was pretty great. Asked people on X what I should see and got a lot of recommendations. The top recommendation actually was to see the Churchill War Rooms, which is where he conducted the Second World War. And they have a big Churchill museum in there as well. And that was incredible. Definitely recommend to anybody who goes over there who has an interest in history and politics that they see that. Another great highlight was I saw a production of Romeo and Juliet at Shakespeare's Globe, so that was pretty cool. And then I headed up to the conference. Great trip overall.
So when you went to the Globe, did you do the standing seats or did you pay for the sweet box of hard wooden benches?
No, I'm too cheap to pay for the good seats. So like a English peasant, I stood in the middle. It was, it kind of reminded me of, being at a music concert when I was younger. So you're standing there watching the show, and it was pretty neat. They even had a few things that they used to bring the actors into the crowd a few times. So it was really interesting to see how they did it. And honestly, I forgot that I was standing. It was a great experience.
That's great. So Radio Free Campus, 100% solidarity with all peasants. That's awesome.
That's right, yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about this conference. I mean, I know what the title was. You can tell us that, obviously, but I don't know much about this program and about what the conference itself was about. So, how did it go? What did you take in from that?
Yeah, it was really interesting. Obviously, we'll ask Eric about this in a few minutes, but he's set up a new center for Heterodox Social Science, and this was the inaugural conference for this new center that he set up. And he had a great range of people there. And basically, most of the presentations were divided into two tracks, one of which he's calling critical wokeness studies, which, we'll ask him to explain what that is. And then he had people just sort of presenting on their heterodox social science research, the kind of research that, struggles to find a home in the contemporary academy. So it was, I guess 2.5 days of presentations, people from North America, Europe, Australia. So, it was an interesting conference and a great group of people.
That's wonderful. So why don't we go ahead and get right to this interview? And, I think you're appropriately placed to do the honors of introducing our audience to our guest.
Today, we're excited, as you mentioned, to talk to Eric Kaufmann, who's a professor of politics at the University of Buckingham in the United Kingdom. He's just started this new center for Heterodox Social Science, and we'll be asking him about that. Eric, welcome to Radio Free Campus.
Great to be here, Steve.
Yeah, it's great to have you with us, and it was great to see you in Buckingham a couple of weeks ago. Thanks again for putting on what was truly a great conference.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I have to say it exceeded even my highest expectations, and the feedback's just been amazing. So that's been very encouraging. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that tells us. There seems to be a hunger out there, and I'm going to hope to be able to develop that in the coming months.
That's good. Yeah, that's great to hear. And this, of course, was the inaugural conference for your new Center of Heterodox Social Science, which you set up just recently. And I wanted to open the interview today. We want to ask you generally about challenges to free expression and intellectual diversity in academia and some of the broader trends that are feeding into those issues. But I wanted to start out by asking you to sort of give us a quick overview of how you see the problem. And I think actually you have a bit of a personal story here too, in terms of how you came to be at the University of Buckingham and start this center. So if you don't mind, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your own experience and how that fits into some of the broader issues that you see in your own scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, really, I think the issue we're talking about consists of two aspects, one being what we might call cancellation from above, from your institution, punishing you, usually at the behest of various activists or administrators. And the second is just the peer pressure, political discrimination, ostracism from peers, ideological prejudice, and likewise. So, I mean, in my case, really, it was more the former, that a small number of activists were able to put in complaints and get me investigated by the university. And I think I had about 4 different internal investigations. Now, they don't tend to go anywhere or result in anything concrete, but it's kind of like the punishment is the process. That's sort of the theme. Now, of course, I also had the odd open letter and Twitter mobbing, and so I'm a kind of veteran of the Great Awakening, I guess. It reminds me at the Stanford Academic Freedom Conference when they said who'd been canceled, and like 90% of people in that room raised their hand. I guess I'm sort of at the mid level. I'm not I didn't get pushed out, but it wasn't Kathleen Stark level or Carol Hoover. But on the other hand, it was kind of worse than some. But that wasn't really necessarily enough on its own to drive me out. I think it was also the fact that I thought it was time, to put my money where my mouth was. University of Buckingham, which was founded really by Thatcher and by neoclassical free market economists in the 70s. But really its potential as a free speech university really hadn't been developed or had only been very slightly developed. And I kind of thought it would be a good place it was the only institution in the UK out of about 200 where, you might be able to set up a free speech oriented countercultural social science center. And I thought that's kind of what was missing was the countercultural social science. We have now a lot of the schools of civic thought, which are very humanities focused, for example, great books, American Constitution, civics. What is kind of missing is really the cancelable or off-piste kind of social science that will get people very riled up. And those sorts of centers are in limited supply. And I kind of thought that was a niche in the market, but really needed to happen. And so that was kind of the origins.
That's great. And like you said, it sounds like a lot of people who are at your conference agree with that assessment. So if you're calling it the Center of Heterodox Social Science, and you just used the phrase countercultural as well, I guess that suggests that there is a kind of reigning orthodoxy maybe in higher ed, or a culture that you're trying to counter in some degree. So can you say a little bit about that? I know you spend a lot of time doing social science, looking at the data, looking at survey results. So what do you see there that you think needs to be countered, or maybe leave a little bit of room for more heterodox thinkers?
Yeah, I mean, probably your viewers are familiar just with the raw numbers. In the Ivy League, it's like 96-4 Democrat to Republican in terms of political donations. So in terms of people who are passionate about politics, you have an incredible skew. Even passively, if we take registration data, there have been papers that have looked at that, and it's something like 13 or 14 to 1 left to right, or Republican to Democrat, certainly in the social science and humanities. And in some institutions and subjects like anthropology or sociology, it would be almost totally on the left. So yeah, we have a real monoculture problem politically in particularly research universities, and in particular the politicized subjects. So that's social sciences, humanities, perhaps minus to some degree economics, which is a little bit more technical to some degree, and certain branches of philosophy. But basically, in those subjects, you have a very intense political conformity going on. And so what that means really is a lot of subjects are never explored or underexplored because they're unfashionable, or there's taboos against exploring them. For example, what is the impact of heredity on crime? What is, to what extent is family structure going to explain race gap, for example? So these are just very controversial areas which you're dissuaded from studying, and you aren't going to get promoted or published or hired if you study them. So we have a big gap in knowledge production in the social sciences and humanities. We need to fill it somehow. And that's kind of one of the major aims of the conference. So there's really two parts. I mean, one aim of the conference in the center is really to fill in the blanks, if you like, and rebalance our understanding of society and the social world. Musa Al-Gharbi, I saw a talk of his where he showed that really about 85% of sociology research is about inequality. That's just way too much. It's not that I am against research on inequality, but that has to be kind of balanced with research on other things, sociology of the family, and for example, or religion. And at the same time, we have the problem of all these gaps, and then we also have the problem of what I will call the absence of research on woke as an ideology or social justice as an ideology. So looking in the mirror is really uncomfortable when universities are trying to badge these political ideologies as neutral, natural, universal things that every good person should believe in. And so we don't have a study of social justice ideology the way we have a study of fascism, nationalism, populism, and even communism. Normally when we get a new phenomenon or an upsurge like in populism or globalization or nationalism, you get an outpouring of conferences and textbooks and articles and courses, and that's just not happened with woke. So that needs to happen. And so the other part of this is really to inaugurate the field of call it critical woke studies. We need to look at this ideology academically.
Great. Well, let me let Justin jump in here.
It's nice to meet you, Eric. We're on with Eric Kaufmann, professor of politics at the University of Buckingham and the author of The Third Awakening. And I wanted to talk a little bit about your book. You had just mentioned the phrase social justice, and in popular discourse, when people are thinking about woke ideology, woke phenomena, they're talking about, social justice warriors and cultural Marxists and a variety of other terms like that to describe the radical left. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about your book is while you're aware of those folks, you talk about an actual, like a different part of the liberal movement, what you call modern liberals, as a much stronger driver of these changes. And so, I found that a little bit surprising. And I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit more about what these liberals are and how they are, driving things in a way that, really doesn't seem to get talked about as much.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, Justin, because I think the literature on woke has tended to go with a kind of story about the history of ideas, postmodernism, for example, critical theory, developing out of the Frankfurt School, these sorts of stories. Chris Rufo's book, America's Cultural Revolution, for example, very much focuses on Marcuse and Paulo Freire and some of these Marxists who sort of, if you like, pull out the cassette tape that says class and stick in the one that says identity. And I think that's all right and that's all true. So I'm not quibbling with the intellectual history. I'm just quibbling with the idea that that's the main driver of how we got here. I actually would argue more along the lines of Gad Saad's upcoming book around suicidal empathy, that you take something like empathy for weak or marginalized groups, something like an exaggerated fear or catastrophizing fear of majorities as being prone to fascism, for example, and something like guilt over privilege, white guilt, for example. So guilt, empathy, and what I would call fascist scare or catastrophization over the majority. Boiled down to its simplest, majority equals something bad, minority equals something good. These very simple kind of emotional structures have been developed around race, gender, and sexual identities in the course of the last 50, 60 years. I don't think that's a Marxist project necessarily. I think that there are cultural Marxists that have rationalized what I think is a deeper, more emotional kind of movement. And so if you look at, for example, affirmative action, if you look at speech codes, if you look at self-esteem, the whole rhetoric around dead white males and Eurocentrism, a lot of this is actually not coming from a kind of Marxist lineage. It's actually much more kind of therapeutic. We have to be super nice to super vulnerable people, and we got to be really wary about those scary oppressors and discriminators, or we're going to be back in 1933 Germany, or women back in the home and gays in the closet and all. So that kind of much simpler emotional structure, which I think is possessed to some degree by a very large number of people, let's say in academia, where the median academic is a soft leftist. And they would say, yeah, we're not diverse enough, we're too male, we're too pale. Now, they won't go and say, like Ibram X. Kendi, we have to have a rigid quota, and anything less than a rigid quota means there's a system of discrimination. They won't go to that critical theory Marxist language, but they will, by constantly having this open-ended approach, we have to be more inclusive, more diverse, more equitable. They get to the same place in practical terms as the revolutionary. So the evolutionary, guilt-ridden, empathetic liberal gets to the same place as the cultural Marxist from a more emotional mission creep perspective. And I'm not actually sure, if we think about a slight majority of Seattle citizens endorsing defund the police, do we think it's because they perceived an invisible structure of white supremacy that needed to be overthrown and that incarceration was part of that structure? Did they have this whole Marxist analysis, or was it much simpler than that? I feel guilty and I feel sorry for this group, and that's it. I think it was the latter, and that's really the point. Is I just think this sort of creeping mission creep in the definition of terms like racism, like discrimination, like white supremacy, that's all been made possible by this therapeutic left liberalism.
In your answer, which I thought was really thoughtful, you used the word guilt a few times. And so, I'm just curious, do you think instead of maybe cultural Marxism as a major driver, there are echoes of cultural Christianity or cultural religion more broadly, that there are these older understandings of guilt and atonement that are kind of being corrupted or repurposed in a strange way?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think yes is the answer, the short answer. Nietzsche's critique of what he calls slave morality, which of course is way over the top, and I don't agree with a lot of it. But yeah, there's no doubt that, Christianity, which then influences Christian socialism and utopian socialism, all of which Marx, the scientific socialists, had nothing but scorn for. Marx really wasn't very woke, and he hated the idealists. But the reality is that those utopian socialists and Christian socialists really won the day, and it's their ethos that it comes through in the U.S. case. The liberal progressives and the pluralists in the early and mid 20th century, initially they were feeling sorry for the European immigrant groups as against the rural WASP majority and its immigration restrictions and its prohibition of alcohol and all these other things. But then that gets transposed onto race from the 60s onwards. So yeah, I think this religious origin is important. This humanitarianism, this idea of we're always on the side of the weak and vulnerable. Now, that comes to coalesce around only certain kinds of weak and vulnerable, around racial, sexual, and women, and those happen to be dominant in the current order. But I think, yeah, that's a very important root of this, rather than Marxism per se.
Thank you. That's a lot to.
There's a lot. There's a lot there.
The existential foundation of wokeism, man. That's like a whole other episode.
I know.
Could do a whole other conference on that.
It's worth saying that Shelby Steele's book White Guilt, I think, is a must read for understanding the whole guilt complex. And he just talks about the cultural power shifting, where blacks had to be deferential to whites who had the cultural power, and then it flipped. And whites had to be deferential to blacks who had the cultural power. And in fact, all the American institutions had to signal how anti-racist they were in order to retain moral legitimacy. I think that's still one of the best paradigms for understanding. I call it the Big Bang of our moral universe, that mid-60s race taboo. Of course, we needed a norm against racism, but to go for a very black and white absolutist thing, of course, it then is going to be weaponized and stretched and expanded.
Yeah, so Eric, you recently published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal and in there you were talking about the idea of what you're calling post-progressive politics. And I did see you present on this as well at the conference, and
hopefully not too badly.
it was a great presentation. I'm not sure that everyone in the audience agreed with you. I think you got some pretty good questions afterwards, and I have to say too, at the conference, I was struck by others who are from the UK and some of their comments on the situation there. Compared to the United States, like obviously in the United States, we tend to think the situation's quite bad, and we have a long road to go. But it sounds like in the UK, it's even worse. And, there was more than one person who said, either to me in conversation or even publicly on the stage, that your center is really the only one that they have, And, so that was, I'm laughing, but that was, kind of depressing to hear, from the standpoint of people over there. But in any event, I'd like you to ask you to sort of explain briefly what you mean by this idea that we are entering a post-progressive politics.
Well, what I think is that I don't mean to say woke is finished or woke is dying, and neither of which I believe. But what I mean to say is that there's a cluster of ideas around, equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for minority race, gender, and sexual identity groups, which has been, I would argue, the dominant set of values in Western societies since the 60s, actually, and I go back that far. That the excesses and extremes of that ideology were laid bare in the Great Awakening and, the George Floyd moment, for example, the excesses of Me Too and cancel culture. And I think forced some people to rethink. Trans is another issue which I want to talk about. So as a result of these excesses, I think there's more of a questioning. It used to be, I think the view used to be, we just can't have enough anti-racism and anti-sexism and anti-homophobia. Those are the values. We know they're absolute 100% truth, and all we have to do is push the gas pedal down to the max. I think now there's some understanding that actually you can overreach and go wrong by doing that. Now, when I say there's some understanding, I mean amongst who? Okay, amongst very elite senior liberal people, like CEOs of corporations, for example, cutting back on DEI. I'm talking about some university presidents and some boards of trustees who are thinking about, political neutrality and who are thinking about rolling back DEI a little bit. And perhaps, senior editors of major newspapers, including the New York Times and Washington Post and various other places. So at the sort of top level of prestige level of society, I think there is a rethink going on and there's been some movement. Now, when it comes to the average member of the public, I think on the trans issue, there's definitely been, in the last 2-3 years, we've got the data, there's been significant rollback of the trans activist agenda. I mean, it's lost 20 points probably in public opinion. Most markedly in young people under 25, it's really lost. So there's no question that there have been some defeats, and I can't think of any public opinion defeat for the cultural left in the last 60 years. I'm struggling. And so this is very important because there's this aura of invincibility and inevitability, like we are the right side of history and history's moving in our direction. And I think that confidence has been dented. You see that a little bit with the loss of energy, perhaps, in progressive activism. Certainly Trump 2024 versus Trump 2016 in terms of the marching and the mass mobilization. We can bracket the Gaza stuff. We can bracket the no king stuff. I think that's quite separate. I think, though, just in terms of raw energy, in terms of progressive organizing, I think that was depleted to some degree. So, yeah, I think now against that, of course, there are other currents, and there's no question that young people are more woke, and when they become the median voter, I don't think they're going to be as committed to free speech. I think that's a risk, and there's also no question that on affirmative action, some of the gains that were made during the Great Awakening by the left seem to have remained in the latest waves of public opinion. So it's a mixed picture. It's by no means a victory, total victory. I do think, however, there are bright spots.
Okay, interesting. Now, we spoke a couple of years ago on ACTA's main podcast, Higher Ed Now, and I was asking you at that time about an op-ed you'd written and some work you were doing about trends in academia, specifically among faculty. And if I recall correctly, you were saying that the data were suggesting that the upcoming generation of academics, in some ways, looked like it might be even more intolerant or monocultural than the current one. Is that correct? That I'm remembering that correctly? And if so, is that still basically what you're seeing, or do you think there are cracks showing in that as well?
I think, unfortunately, I haven't seen any data that would contradict that picture. Younger leftists in the population are roughly twice as censorious or as intolerant as older leftists, and that's mirrored in the faculty, where the older faculty are not much different in terms of their political orientations. They're more or less as left-wing as the young, but are considerably more free speech oriented. And so I'm still very concerned that when the young academics of today start running departments, and start running research bodies, look out. So I'm not actually more optimistic. Now, there are a few, who knows what these numbers mean. I mean, it is true that, the major survey in 2022 showed that roughly 65%, 2/3 of left-wing academics, which is the vast majority of those sampled, supported mandatory diversity statements. That number in the latest FIRE faculty survey was around 50% among left-wing academics. So it's gone down a little bit. I don't know how. We'll have to watch the numbers over successive waves to see whether there's been a shift. It may be that, I think in the U.S., the fact of Trump, the fact of the bad publicity universities are getting, I do think to some degree, sometimes culture is affected by politics. Sometimes a political challenge to the left's domination of campus can open minds up. And maybe it has led to a rethink to some degree. That's a very hopeful read. I can't yet prove that.
Okay, well, I guess that leads to the question of, what should we do about it, right? How can we address the monoculture? How can we address the lack of space for free expression and intellectual diversity? I think Justin was going to ask a question about that.
Yeah, Eric, in your book, The Third Awakening, you offer a 12-point plan for change, and it talks about a number of topics. And some of them are things that, at ACTA, we're very clear about promoting and have, had campaigns for, like Chicago principles, Calvin, institutional neutrality. There was something in your list that I thought was really intriguing, and it's not something that is talked about as often. And it's this phrase, equivalent action. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that means. Do you still think that's needed in the post-progressive era? How could we implement something like that in higher ed if it's still necessary?
Yeah, I think it would be a fun idea. I think it would be a good idea. So what I mean by equivalent action is, if you think about what the Trump administration's letter to Harvard said, it more or less said you got to get rid of DEI on race and sex, but we kind of want you to do some DEI on conservatism and politics. And I just think that's not really a consistent position. Just as the university's existing position, which was that we want to go all in on DEI for race and sex and do nothing on political diversity, is also inconsistent. So I had sort of come up with this idea of equivalent action, which says, you have to match exactly in magnitude anything you do on race and sex, but with action on politics and political beliefs. So, for example, if you collect data, if you make applicants to a program indicate their race and sex, then you need to make them indicate where they are on a left-right scale or a liberal-conservative scale and who they voted for or who they support. Just to collect that data. If you then want to expand your pipeline and recruit to increase diversity in race or sex, you need to do the same, show the same activity and efforts in recruiting, let's say, conservatives or Republicans. That would be what I mean by equivalent action, and there would be fines put in place for universities that only did the progressive DEI and not the conservative DEI. Part of this is to say that, I am a supporter of a merit-based approach, but at the same time, I think just going in on the colorblind stuff isn't necessarily enough, because clearly, you can do colorblind and that won't do anything for viewpoint diversity. I think viewpoint diversity is a huge problem in academia, and I think it's not unreasonable. For example, if you have a SAT score that's standardized, everyone has to meet, once you have two candidates that have an equivalent score, perhaps to start recruiting in certain areas or certain places you haven't recruited in before, or offer some kind of extra training or perhaps guidelines to underrepresented groups. That in and of itself, I think, is not unreasonable. The problem is that universities can't be trusted to actually do this in a fair and proportionate manner. Whereas I think if we had this equivalent action stipulation, it would act as a check on their desire to implement, for example, very radical, quotas, for example, on race and sex, because they know they would have to do the same for Republicans. So if they want to recruit 13% black and 50% women, they're going to have to recruit 50% Republicans. I think that would act as a check, an inbuilt check, and I think it's more consistent, whereas what we have now is really a battle between two inconsistent philosophies battling it out, and I'm just not sure that gets us there. I also think, by the way, a purely merit-based approach is not going to solve necessarily the viewpoint diversity problem, because we simply have a pipeline issue. And as long as we've got that pipeline issue that's very skewed, we're never going to get viewpoint diversity in the faculty.
Right.
Well, that's fascinating.
So, Eric, as a way of bringing the conversation to a close, and this has been very interesting, thanks again for speaking with us. I just wanted to throw up a slide that you used in the talk that you gave at the very end of the conference a couple of weeks ago, where I think you were kind of presenting a sort of ecosystem for heterodox social science, and I thought it'd just be interesting to hear you just give us a quick rundown of what you have in mind here, and how you think this project that you're building could help to alleviate some of the issues we've been talking about in terms of free expression and viewpoint diversity on campus.
Yeah, I suppose the reality of this slide is that I'm not hugely optimistic that the mainstream system is going to become a tolerant environment anytime soon, and I'm not hugely optimistic that viewpoint diversity is going to come in anytime soon either. And so if we're talking about the production of knowledge and pursuit of truth, this is really what the university is supposed to be doing. If we want to rebalance the knowledge about society, we're actually going to have to build a kind of countercultural parallel ecosystem in order to produce that knowledge. And in order, more importantly, to amplify facts, reality. We know that, two-parent families, that makes a big difference in terms of the earnings of the offspring. It makes a big difference in terms of crime. It makes a big difference in many ways. But if that is something that never gets cited or promoted within the academy, and it is not going to have the bona fides of top universities behind it when it comes to policy discussions. So what we need to do, but now the good news is that the vast majority of papers in the social sciences and humanities are cited by almost nobody or by only a handful of people. So the vast majority of research is kind of not important. What we need is to get the very small number of dissident research that is trying to ski off the ski hill in what we call in Europe off-piste. We need that kind of research to be brought into the broader discussion of what is knowledge. And so we need to actually have greater impact and amplification of that. What I've got here is I talk about a number of centers. So we have non-progressive universities, University of Austin, for example, non-progressive centers. These would be the schools of civic thought, or perhaps my center as well. So you have a number of these environments where heterodox ideas can flourish. One of the problems with being a dissident researcher in the mainstream system is you kind of have to remain partially or fully in the closet, or you have to keep your research on the quiet, and you can't really amplify it. And so I think, one of my arguments is we are going to need these somewhat ring-fenced, quote-unquote, safe spaces. I hate to use that term, but we know from research that, for example, in the biggest driver of self-censorship is ideological imbalance. So even at the University of Chicago, they have great policies for free speech, but because the student body is so heavily leaning liberal, conservatives are self-censoring. And similarly with academics, when they perceive their median department member to be very much to the left, they self-censor at higher rates. So we need to create these environments where people feel free to speak and do their research. So the centers and the non-progressive universities, I mentioned, ACTA is there amongst a series of organizations like Heterodox Academy, FIRE, Free Speech Union, AFA. These are organizations that do research, that do dissemination, and they're very much a part of this ecosystem. And they're going to be needed in order to amplify the small amount of work. Maybe there are 50,000 dissidents, and maybe there's a million mainstream social scientists. So we're going to need the dissidents' work amplified through these means. Think tanks, we talked about the IEACE Johns Hopkins link. The University of Buckingham has a link to a free market think tank as well. Think tanks have money. They can sponsor research. Now, they often don't do that long-term patient deep dive into the literature kind of research that academics do, but I think there's a fruitful synergy there. And then finally, trying to develop alternative sources of funding and also outlets that aren't gate-kept. Now, of course, we know all what's happening at the National Science Foundation. Whatever. I mean, one of the questions is going to be whether these research bodies actually are going to fund viewpoint diverse research, heterodox research. I did make this suggestion to some people who I thought had the ear of the administration or the Department of Education. I don't know if anything will happen there, but that could be one solution. But in any case, we do need some alternative pots of money to fund research that wouldn't be funded ordinarily because it'll be gatekept by the panel members at these research foundations. And then finally, dissident journals. We talked about, representatives of Theory and Society or Lee Jussum's Journal of Open Inquiry in the Behavioral Sciences. So there are a number of different journals and also some academic presses that are willing to publish. So we then are able to create something that can produce knowledge, get it into the press, get it into the policy sphere, and actually start to tilt what is knowledge back to the truth and away from the warped out. It's not to say that everything done in academia is garbage. No, I mean a lot of it is just fine, but certainly around contentious subjects. The more contentious you are around race, sex, sexual orientation, gender, the less likely you are to be published. So what comes out, I think Lee Jussum showed this, for example, when it comes to papers on discrimination against women in academia. The one paper that found a result that women were being discriminated against is cited like many, many, many times more than the many or several that find discrimination against men, which have actually a much larger statistical power, much more rigorous, but get no citations. And so they don't wind up in the textbooks.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think this slide sort of gives a good overview of how, different people and, different organizations can try to, help with this process of opening up some space for the other kinds of social science, the other perspectives that you've been talking about. And certainly at ACTA, we're happy to, help, in our own way to do those sorts of things too. But yeah, so, this has been really interesting. Thanks again for joining us on the podcast, and we'll have to have you again sometime down the road.
Thanks, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Eric. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks a lot.
Well, we've just been talking with Eric Kaufmann, professor of politics at the University of Buckingham. Fantastic interview about a whole host of topics related to trying to get higher ed to be less bad than what it currently is. Steve, I know we had talked about this article previously, but it just so happens that a lot of the topics that Eric had brought up also came up in a piece in The Atlantic by Rose Horowitz, right? And the title of this is "The Era of DEI for Conservatives Has Begun," which sounds awesome and terrifying and paradoxical. And, a lot of what her article discussed is a lot of what Eric's research has also shown, that the faculty at schools, skews overwhelmingly left. professors are pretty clear and not really all that, reserved about it actively discriminating against conservative candidates in the job pool, and that this has also caused a significant level of alienation from the broader civil society. This is stuff that we know pretty well, from our own work at ACTA, but is also talking about these organizations like AEI partnering with Johns Hopkins or these various centers, that have been set up. And I think, one of these questions in my own mind that I still don't really have a clear answer to is letting things go as they are is a guaranteed way to perpetuate the unsatisfactory nature of our present situation. It does get kind of strange if what you're doing is saying, stop hiring these people for identity characteristics, hire those people for identity characteristics.
Yeah.
I think sympathetic to that problem. You're dealing with such a massive imbalance. I don't think it sounds as obviously hypocritical or stupid. But,
although I do think that, I think that's definitely something we have to avoid at all costs. I don't think we want DEI for conservatives or affirmative action for conservatives. I mean, Eric was quite good just now on detailing, some of the issues and why this is such a difficult problem to address. But I know at ACTA, what we recommend in our gold standard is the University of Chicago's Shills report, which kind of completes the Chicago trifecta along with the Chicago statement and the Calvin report and institutional neutrality. But the basic idea there is that you're hiring based on merit and sort of future promise in terms of scholarship, teaching, and contribution to intellectual community, and you do so without regard to politics or ideology. And there's people often already think every time you discuss the lack of conservatives in higher ed, somebody will say, well, that's because conservatives just aren't that smart, or their ideas are terrible or whatever. And, for that reason alone, I think we want to avoid the idea that we're engaging in any kind of affirmative action. But I also think just as a matter of principle, that's not really the way that we want to go. So, to me, what we want to do is restore a system of merit-based hiring, or create one maybe for the first time, and look at people in terms of like the quality of their scholarship, the quality of their teaching, that sort of thing. And then maybe there are some other things, around that can be done. Like Eric had some interesting points there about maybe analyzing your department and asking, we have 9 people studying inequality, but we don't have anybody studying religion in our sociology program. Well, maybe that's something we need to fix. And so you hire someone who does sociology of religion. Maybe the person who takes that job votes for the Democrats. Maybe that person votes for the Republicans. Who knows? But that's a start towards creating a department that is more open to intellectual and viewpoint diversity, I think. It will be a long road for sure, but I think that's generally the kind of approach that we have to take.
Yeah, no, I thought the article overall was pretty fair, which was surprising given that it came from The Atlantic. But I think the title is misleading, right? Because I've seen the job ads for a lot of these centers at, ASU or the various centers that have emerged in Ohio. And they're not saying we're looking for conservative intellectuals. They're not hiring with conservative statements, like an equivalent to a DEI statement. There's a correlation maybe, but not a causation. In other words, maybe conservative intellectuals are more drawn to teaching in a classical liberal environment than people who would want to go into really highly partisan and ideologized sociology departments and stuff, to kind of bring it back to Eric,
yeah,
right?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure there's something to that. I think another thing to point out about a lot of these civic centers that have been created is that they've been created with bipartisan support by their state legislatures in a lot of cases, funded by them. And so that shows that they're not, that's one way that shows that they're not conservative or ideologically driven in that sort of partisan sense. But you can have an institution or a center within an institution that has a certain mission, and you're hiring people who sort of fit pedagogically or in terms of their interests with that broader mission. And I think that certainly makes sense. You're not, asking people, who did you vote for in the last election or anything like that when you're hiring them. You're saying, do you believe in what we're doing here, and do you think you'd be a fit for it? Do you care about the kinds of questions that we're asking? I mean, I could imagine maybe in like a political science department, which both of you were in, you and I are both political scientists or political theorists by training, or maybe a public policy program, having nobody from one of the major political parties on the faculty might be kind of a problem. Like if you're actually discussing debates about public policy, that sort of thing. So you got to think about like maybe different departments in different situations too. On the other hand, if you're hiring someone to teach chemistry, how much could it possibly matter, who this person votes for?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's important, and it's super complicated, right? Because it doesn't strictly matter in a partisan sense when you're thinking about like departments of history or literature, but there are ways in which those topics could be taught that I think students would actually like, that they just don't get exposed to.
Absolutely.
For ideological reasons. Yeah,
absolutely.
We could talk about that, of course, all day, but there's also, just this never-ending saga. I mean, when I think of this thing between Harvard and Trump, it reminds me, because I'm not a very smart man, because I'm a conservative, right? But, in that Mad Max movie where they go into Thunderdome and everyone starts chanting, 2 men enter, 1 man leaves, This is a really tense situation where I think it's going to be really hard for either side to kind of walk back from the positions that they've taken. But, I think one of the nice things about the work that we do at ACTA is, we're not thinking about this along partisan lines. We're going to support this or that because of who they voted for or whatever. But we also work with different kinds of groups like alumni and trustees and people like that that give us a better insight into, how could you actually take some of the volume down and get real change accomplished. So, where could a place like Harvard, and, especially Harvard, go to get to the place that, they might end up being dragged to through the court system anyways?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, obviously the Harvard situation is not good, to say the least. I noticed, by the way, Harvard Magazine just did a big article on it that quotes a bunch of people from Harvard and elsewhere, their views on this matter. But the top is a graphic that somebody designed, and on one side is Harvard's president, Alan Garber, and he's got boxing gloves on, and I think like Harvard's logo is on there, or its coat of arms or whatever. And then on the other side is Trump with his boxing gloves, and his gloves have American flags on them. So I don't know what the artist was trying to say. But
maybe I should have gone with like Rocky IV, where it's Rocky versus the Soviet boxer.
Yeah, I don't know. They're trying to suggest they should like settle this the old-fashioned way or something like that. But
why not?
But yeah, more seriously, I mean, the reporting that we've seen on the Harvard situation, it seems like it escalated the way that it did, partly almost by mistake. That the government sent a letter that maybe wasn't supposed to be sent. Some of the demands in that letter, clearly went too far, and suggested that the government was demanding things that, it's constitutionally prohibited from demanding. Our president at ACTA, Michael Polikoff, just wrote an excellent article on this situation where he talked about being able to hold two thoughts at once, right? And in my words, not his, Harvard to me is just nobody's hero. They have so many problems. They need so much reform. I mean, just today, there was a report by Aaron Siberium at the Free Beacon, and, we'll see how this plays out, but he's gotten hold of a bunch of documentation that appears to suggest that the Harvard Law Review, which I guess is technically an independent entity from Harvard itself, but nevertheless, has sort of systematically considered race and other protected characteristics in its editorial process in terms of how it selects articles and that sort of thing. This is a school that was already hammered by the Supreme Court for race-based or race-conscious admissions. So the fact that this would still be going on at an institution or a law review that's attached to Harvard is just so egregious. But one thing I wanted to highlight with Harvard, and certainly Harvard has a right to push back against the Trump administration when it's overreaching and needs to defend itself. At the same time, a lot of people have been saying that Harvard needs to change even before Trump got elected. ACTA, of course, is one group that's been saying that, but there's been people on campus as well, right? So there's the Council for Academic Freedom, and then there's an alumni group, the 1636 Forum. There's a similar one at Columbia, Stand Columbia. These are groups of of people who are part of the Harvard community, and the Stan Columbia one isn't just alumni, it includes people who are currently on campus. But they've made lists of reforms, many of which are consistent with things that, we at ACTA recommend. And Harvard's done a few things in the last year or two, but some of those things have been, easier lifts. And, clearly the place needs some significant cultural change. And we're not seeing a ton of that yet. And so on the one hand, while, like I said, it's certainly understandable that Harvard is going to defend itself against some of the overreach. At the same time, I can't get on board with like this other alumni group, Crimson Courage, I think it's called, and like they're sort of rah singing fight songs, talking about defending their alma mater, and I'm just like, sorry, but like Harvard is just not that kind of hero. Even if some of they might win some of the lawsuits that they're currently involved in.
Yeah. No, I think that makes total sense. I guess maybe a parting message for them would be that Harvard, get your act together. You have nothing to lose except billions of dollars.
Yeah. And I think, if they implemented a lot more of these reforms, made a more honest effort, they would, win a lot of people to their side, too. There's a lot of people out there that want Harvard to reform and want it to be a better institution. So why not do it?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The things that ACTA would want them to do are entirely reasonable, legal, and good things to do.
Yeah, that would make it a better place. So
yeah, and it takes so much of that argument away from people who may very well want Harvard not to exist or to be, really significantly diminished.
That's right. And there is, I don't know what percentage of people feel that way, but there certainly is some sentiment to that effect. There's obviously the statistic that people cite quite regularly about the drop in confidence in higher ed. I've seen some other surveys recently that suggest that, Harvard polls somewhat decently. Like it definitely has its critics. Don't get me wrong. It's got serious problems. But I think, if it were to fix some of those serious problems, public sentiment towards Harvard would be probably pretty good.
Yeah, I totally agree. All right. We won't make our audience wait any longer. We're going to move into the most glorious, excellent component of our episode every month, the Apparatchik of the Month and Hero of the People Awards.
Yeah, so last time I think I did the Apparatchik of the Month, and so this time I'm happy to do the Hero of the People and feature somebody who's really doing some good work in higher ed. And the person I want to talk about is the president of Dartmouth College, Cian Bialik. She has actually received praise even from Trump officials in recent weeks, and alumni groups that are interested in free speech on campus. The Alumni Free Speech Alliance, they've been posting some videos showing her saying some things that support, free expression and intellectual diversity on campus. But, I saw yesterday or the day before, there was an interview with her in the student newspaper, the Dartmouth. And one of the questions they asked her was how Dartmouth has so far sort of avoided the ire of the Trump administration. And I got the impression, I don't want to assume that I know what she was thinking, but I kind of got the impression that she didn't quite like the way that question was framed, perhaps. But it is true that, on the list of colleges that are being investigated for anti-Semitism, I think Dartmouth is the only Ivy League college that's not on that list. In response to the students, she pointed to some really interesting things. She mentioned that they had gone back to using standardized testing in admissions, which is, I think, an important step. Obviously, a number of schools have moved away from that, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dartmouth was one of the first elite institutions that had gone away from it to reinstitute using them. So introducing again that idea of merit-based admissions by using standardized tests. But then she also talked about their commitment to free expression. Dartmouth has adopted a policy of, well, we would call it institutional neutrality. They call it institutional restraint. Sometimes there's a debate about whether those are the same thing, but in our view, I think, when we analyze what the policy actually says, it seems pretty consistent with the Calvin report and the idea of institutional neutrality. And one thing she didn't mention in the interview that I think also needs to be pointed out is she didn't really tolerate disruptive protests or like an encampment that was violating campus rules. Dartmouth didn't really have serious problems with those things in the way that a lot of other elite campuses did, because she basically acted right away, which is something that ACT, of course, recommends. Have clear rules and policies. When students violate those policies, let them know that's what they're doing and that there's going to be consequences if they don't stop. And that's basically what she did. And so they didn't have these massive problems. And so, like I said, they're not being investigated for anti-Semitism on their campus. And, a lot of people are celebrating Dartmouth right now. I'm not saying that the place doesn't need further reforms or anything, but, relative to a lot of the other things that we're seeing in higher ed, and especially on our elite college campuses, Dartmouth President C.N. Bielek seems to be doing a great job.
Well, I think that's excellent, Steve. I think Dartmouth deserves credit for the steps that they've taken to make meaningful reforms and bring their institution back into alignment with high academic principles. Unfortunately, there's always the other side of the higher ed coin. There's always a Lex Luthor lurking in Superman's shadow. And that brings us to the Apparatchik of the month. So gather round, young pioneers, and hear tale of the Dean of the Yale Divinity School. In a story in the College Fix by Ibrahim Garza, it is reported that the Dean of the Yale Divinity School, Dr. Gregory Sterling, sent an email to, quote, the entire Divinity School. So I assume that includes faculty and students and staff. And in this email, the dean sent an opinion piece that he published in MSNBC describing the anti-Christian nature of President Trump's funding cuts for USAID. As the story explains, the email ends with Dean Sterling writing, "I know that you share my concerns," unquote. Now, in point of fact, I would bet money that he's almost certainly right about that. Still, right? Sharing an opinion piece about current events and implying that faculty and staff and students surely agree with his perspective on both Christianity and President Trump's actions is exactly the kind of move an administrator would make when he's uninterested in promoting diversity of thought in his school. So with that, congratulations, Dean Sterling. Your commitment to an intellectual monoculture has earned you our prestigious Apparatchik of the Month award. We're going to get you your complimentary Lada Vaz 2101 car soon. We're just waiting for all of the parts and have been since about 1975.
This reminds me, too, that Yale did recently adopt a kind of institutional neutrality policy. We should go back and look at that and see how this might fit or not fit with what they said they were going to adhere to.
Yeah, it's one of those stories where it's so stereotypically bad higher ed that we featured it this month.
Yeah, and I guess we should say, it's not about, obviously, the substance of the cuts to USAID and whether those were good or bad, but the assumption that everybody would agree with his take on them.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem. It's not his interpretation of Christianity. There are plenty of those. And it's not his interpretation of Trump's funding cuts. Plenty of people disagree. But particularly in higher ed, if your dean sends you a piece of information that's an opinion on current events and says, "I know you agree with me," you know what to do, regardless of how you actually feel. If you want to get a good annual evaluation, or if you're up for T&P soon.
That's right. Yeah. No, it's actually a great illustration.
It's bad management.
Yeah, it's a great illustration of why institutional neutrality is such an important principle. Well, anyways, I think that wraps things up for this episode. So thanks to everyone for listening to Radio Free Campus.
We will see you all next month. And until then, KBO.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Radio Free Campus. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. Audio-only versions of Radio Free Campus are available on all other podcast streaming platforms. Whether you have comments, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, the hosts would love to hear from you. Comment below or email them at radiofreecampus@goacta.org. Radio Free Campus is offered by the Campus Freedom Initiative at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. For more information, please visit goacta.org.
31% of Northern Arizona University students believe students shouldn't be punished for disrupting campus speakers. Discover how ACTA's gold standard can help